truth. How do you ascertain truth in a country like China? I'd like to speak a bit in this video about, and bear with me, this might be a slightly lengthy video, but I do believe the issues are important to cover. A group called Falun Gong. It's a very notorious term in China, even outside China, to Chinese people. And there is a number of things I want to talk about. Firstly, to give you a little bit of background, Falun Gong was a spiritual movement, broadly speaking, that developed out of the Qigong spiritual practice that was popular in the 1980s. In 1992, a character called Li Hongji, self-styled sort of spiritual master, developed this new branch called Falun Gong out of the Qigong movement. Now, for most of the 90s, Falun Gong was seen as relatively harmless. It wasn't. I don't think the government paid it that much attention. It was very popular. But in 1999, suddenly there was a turn of events, and Jiang Zemin decided to crack down on this organization. And basically, since then, the Western perception of Falun Gong / China is that this is a spiritual movement that has been brutally persecuted by an authoritarian regime. Falun Gong themselves go out of their way to try and promote what they argue is evidence for the persecution. Now, I have to say at this point, I am neither a Falun Gong practitioner or member, and I'm no fan of the Communist Party of China. So that's my position. I'm not speaking from either perspective. I'm far from being pro-CCP, and I'm not a member of Falun Gong. So I've got no vested interest here. Anyway, tonight, to give you a bit of background to this, tonight I had a long debate with a friend of mine, a Chinese friend that I've known for some time, about Falun Gong, and she laid out a lot of the sort of things I have come across to some extent before, which is basically the CCP line, which is that they're a dangerous cult. Now, the first thing is, unless we've been directly involved in this organization, none of us can be 100% sure about the truth. The argument that Falun Gong put forward is that the reason they are persecuted is because they became more popular than the Communist Party, so Jiang Zemin saw them as a challenge to the CCP's power and influence. Some academics have even argued that China has a precedent of religiously inspired uprisings. The Taiping Rebellion was a particularly bloody uprising in the mid-19th century that cost millions of lives, and that was inspired by a sort of spiritual movement as well. So there is certainly many areas where the CCP obviously fears this organization. Falun Gong is not the only religious organization to be seen as a threat to China. Not long ago, a woman was murdered in Shandong province by 4 members of a religious cult that supposedly demanded her demanded her phone number, and then brutally murdered her when she refused to give it. And they were from a fundamentalist, I believe, Baptist organization, but they were not mainstream people of faith, take my word for it. They were a cult. Now, the problem is, a lot of the things that the CCP says about Falun Gong are very hard to verify, because they will not. In a country like China, so much is censored, and it is very difficult for Western journalists to do their job. In other words, if a Western journalist wanted to find out the whole picture and wanted to, for example, investigate this, he or she would face a lot of barriers in doing so. They would be told the Communist Party propaganda and be basically say, you have to believe this is what is the fact. So anyway, but I wanted to be open-minded. I wanted to find out both sides. So I've basically typed into Google, what is Falun Gong? Or the truth about Falun Gong. I came across a website, www.facts.org.cm. Now, this basically gives a list of things as to why Falun Gong is dangerous. Information about Li Hongzhi, Falun Gong members being violent towards one another, self-immolations, turning each other against their families, some pretty nasty stuff. They even have a list of contents here. What is Falun Gong? Who is Li Hongzhi? Fallacies of Falun Gong, violating human rights, etc. One thing I want to point out about any Chinese website, any China-based website, now this one's in English, but it's different languages at the top. Pretty much every website that is permitted in China has to have the approval of the CCP. It is indisputable, and my friend conceded this, that the CCP has absolute power in China. Absolute power. So they can absolutely control all information that is in China. Therefore, in China itself, it's impossible to have an objective outlook on this because it is so one-sided. And from my line of thinking, that is why so many Chinese seem to believe the government line that Falun Gong is a dangerous cult. I asked my friend had she personally known any Falun Gong practitioners, and she didn't really seem to want to answer that. I don't know. I haven't known any myself, so I can't say that I absolutely know for a fact what this organization is about. I'm not a member, I'm not a supporter of their particular practices, but one thing I am fairly sure about is that the CCP has a very long track record of censorship, persecution, and basically an iron grip on any sort of dissent. So my overall outlook on this is that two wrongs don't make a right. If, as they say, Falun Gong is a dangerous cult, it still doesn't justify what the CCP does to them. And you know, they say things like there's a huge amount of information on the site. I'll put a link to it, and I'll also put a link to the Falun Gong website so you can see both sides, which you won't be able to see in China because China is a country where only one side is permitted. But I'll put the source there so you can think about that. They say basically the torture photos that Falun Gong show are fabricated, and they have arrested people staging torture photos. Now, I really don't know if that is the case. They're certainly going out of their way to do it if that is the case, and it definitely, if that is what they're doing, then they are an extreme cult. Also, I think we should be open-minded enough to concede that there are groups that call themselves peaceful religious organizations that are basically cults. There's been many examples all over the world. Think of Jim Jones in Guyana in the late 70s. Think of the Westboro Baptist Church, indeed, in the United States. There's many, many examples. So it's just very, very hard to tell who's telling the truth. I came across one video whereby the eccentric Chinese billionaire Chen Guangbiao held a press conference where he brought out two horribly scarred women. Now, if you don't know who this guy is, he's an eccentric billionaire who wants to buy the New York Times. And he's done a lot of publicity stunts, supposedly showing his benevolence. One of the latest was feeding New York's homeless. But I have to say, I am skeptical about a lot of Chinese super rich. The reason is, in a country like China, to get that rich, you need to have a concept called guanxi, which is basically relations with the party, business relations. And I do not believe that someone can get that powerful in Chinese society without having fucked quite a lot of people over. So I just don't trust this guy. I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but I just don't trust him. That's my gut instinct. I think he's basically a CCP stooge, and this whole nice guy image is basically a stunt. For one thing, he can't buy the New York Times because it's not for sale, and if he did, he would just put the CCP propaganda in it. And I think that would be an abomination. Now, he argues that American media is biased against China, but so therefore he's trying to buy Chinese media, American media, in order to put Chinese propaganda into it, which is ridiculous. You know, in many ways, the Communist Party of China is its own worst enemy, because they always complain about being misunderstood, and or not necessarily misunderstood, but they say it's all one big conspiracy against China. But there's some basic things, and this comes to a common sense perspective. If they're so innocent, then why don't they officially, to the rest of the world, say this is why we are cracking down on Falun Gong, because they do this, that, and the other? Instead, any foreigners who want to find out about this are told it's none of their business, and it's an internal matter, this sort of thing. It's the usual sort of rhetoric. But the problem is, the sort of information that Falun Gong is putting out, i.e. that they're victims of a brutal regime, the CCP has done almost nothing to prove that that is not the case. Whereas Falun Gong themselves have produced a huge amount of photographic evidence, videos, etc., showing what the CCP does. Now, what happened basically in this press conference was Chen brought out two women who were horribly scarred, and supposedly what this came from was a self-immolation in 2001, in which Falun Gong members, 7 Falun Gong members, who were supposedly brainwashed, went into Tiananmen Square and set themselves on fire. One of them was a 12-year-old girl. I believe 3 died and 2 were badly maimed. Now, Falun Gong said that they never advocate suicide, and that the CCP stood this situation up. They staged its situation. So let's step back aside and think, well, who the hell is telling the truth here? Now, what I have seen in videos is I've seen peaceful Falun Gong protesters, at least in the videos are peaceful, being attacked by paid CCP stooges in San Francisco. That doesn't exactly cast the CCP in a good light. And there was examples there of elderly CCP practitioners pretending to be assaulted, basically just lying on the ground until police arrived to try and give Falun Gong a bad image. Now, like I say, I really don't know everything about this organisation, so I'm not going to say they are entirely innocent. Certainly what I have seen no evidence of the claims made against them. I have listened to Chinese people and the sort of things that they say, but in the end of the day, there's a lot of young Chinese who believe that Tiananmen Square never happened. The 1989 crackdown never happened. The same people believe that Falun Gong is a cult. So you can see the power of CCP propaganda in China, just how influential they are. And part of the problem is, whatever the truth is, one thing is undeniable. In China itself, it is impossible to have a fair, balanced debate, because the CCP always has the upper hand. So I don't know. Let me play the devil's advocate for a second and say that Falun Gong is a dangerous cult. Okay. In that case, why is it that the CCP will not allow independent investigations into their activities? Why should the rest of the world believe their propaganda? If they are really a dangerous cult, why don't they allow international investigations into Falun Gong? And why is it that I have never come across a source that shows someone outside the Chinese Communist Party or outside China criticizing Falun Gong? I have honestly never come across an external source saying, yeah, the Chinese government was right, they are a cult. However, I've seen people all over the world say the Chinese Communist Party are brutally persecuting this organization. They seem to base their whole argument on this self-immolation incident, which still remains very... there's a lot of question marks about it. It may well... I'm not saying it didn't happen, but there's certain questions such as, were the people there actually Falun Gong practitioners? Had Falun Gong sanctioned it? Had the CCP set that up? And if they were Falun Gong members, then how does Falun Gong justify that? So there's a lot of questions to be asked about that specific incident. Falun Gong does have a responsibility to address that, but the CCP has a responsibility to prove it. Now, it would have been helpful in that video if there was some subtitles that weren't in Chinese, so that those of us who don't want to listen to communist propaganda can make some rational judgment on this. I.e., if these women really were victims of a brainwashing cult, then... But that, it's ironic, because until very recently, one punishment in China was re-education through forced labour. And one of the penalties for so-called petty crimes was re-education through forced labour. But for a long time, supposed dissidents were impacted by this law. Therefore, the CCP is saying that they are brainwashed by Falun Gong, but it may well be the situation that ex-Falun Gong members have been brainwashed by the CCP to believe that they were in a cult rather than a peaceful spiritual movement. I can only go on what I know, and I don't know everything. I have never, in any of the material I have come across with Falun Gong, seen anything that sounds dangerous or provocative or violent. I have been to their website, I've read the material, and I have not seen any sort of rhetoric about forcing anyone to do anything. But history shows us that the Chinese Communist Party does censor its history. So if they want people to believe their line, that this is a dangerous cult that needs to be stopped, then they're not exactly doing themselves any favours. And even if Falun Gong is a dangerous cult, it doesn't justify things like torture. I just don't believe the CCP. That's my gut instinct. Does that mean I 100% believe Falun Gong? No, it doesn't. And I think I'd be very naive to endorse everything they say. I'm not going to be that naive, and I'm not going to believe everything they say. But my gut instinct is the CCP, like all authoritarian regimes, base their existence on massive, massive propaganda. And in the People's Republic of China, only one opinion is allowed, basically. Yes, nowadays private citizens can have opinions about wider issues, but on a very wide range of issues, it's basically forbidden to say anything against the CCP. Now, my friend said that she saw a Falun Gong protester in London and she couldn't understand his attitude, and she would never criticise the CCP and so on. And I pointed out, well, he's not hurting anyone, he's not spreading violence, so he's a right to do that in this country. And she agreed that freedom of expression is a good thing. In China, there's very little freedom of expression unless it's sanctioned by the party. So my conclusion here is that we shouldn't automatically believe Falun Gong is entirely innocent. It may well be a cult. Cults do exist. And I certainly want to find out a lot more about this organisation before I sort of endorse all their arguments. But I still don't believe that the CCP are trustworthy. I believe they are professional liars in many areas. They've proven it time and time again. And I think the reason so many Chinese support the CCP line is because they're fed propaganda on a daily basis. That goes without saying. In China, media sources are utterly controlled by the CCP. That's indisputable. So those are the things that appear obvious from the surface.